Goeiemorgen, mijn naam is Michael en vandaag praat ik oor die Afrikaanse taal. How difficult is Afrikaans to learn? That was one of the first questions I asked after my trip to South Africa in 2014. Well, I've been learning Afrikaans on and off for almost 2 years, and I have to say it's been one of the most enjoyable language learning experiences I've ever had. I've discovered that Afrikaans is one of the simplest languages for English speakers to learn. And there are 2 reasons for that. The first has to do with the history of the Afrikaans language, and the second has to do with Afrikaans grammar. Afrikaans is a West Germanic language spoken mostly in South Africa and Namibia. Afrikaans was first brought to southern Africa by Dutch settlers in the 18th century, and for a long time it was actually considered a dialect of Dutch called Kombuistaal, which means kitchen language. In fact, even today, Afrikaans can be seen as almost a dialect of Dutch because both languages have fairly high levels of mutual intelligibility. But for our purposes, we're going to say that Afrikaans is its own language. In fact, it is a daughter language of Dutch. So what does all that history have to do with English speakers wanting to learn Afrikaans? Well, English is also part of the West Germanic language family, as well as languages like German and Frisian. Dutch is thought to be English's closest relative, often acting as a middle ground between German and English. That means that by consequence, English and Afrikaans are just as close as English and Dutch. In fact, they have a lot of words that are cognates, meaning that they share the same root or they come from the same word. And they also have grammatical features that are common between many West Germanic languages. So let's take a look at a couple phrases in Afrikaans. The first one we have is, what is your name? And that is said as, wat is jou naam? So as you can see, what and wat are very close. Is and is are pretty much the same word. Yo and your are probably the most different, but only because there's a J in the Afrikaans word, even though that J is being pronounced like a Y, an English Y sound. And then lastly, we have naam, meaning name. Next we have hy praat met my vriend. This phrase is a little bit different than the first phrase was, but there still are quite a few similarities. For example, hy means he. In writing, my vriend almost looks exactly like my friend. The major difference comes from praat, which means to speak, and with met, which means with. So by looking at these phrases alone, you can already see that English and Afrikaans are very similar languages. If you speak English, you kind of already have a base in the Afrikaans language. But what if you speak another Germanic language, such as Dutch or German? Let's take a look at those sample phrases again. In Afrikaans, we have wat is jou naam, which we know means what is your name. But in Dutch, it says wat is jouw naam. The spelling is almost exactly the same between Afrikaans and Dutch. It's just little pronunciation differences that set these two languages apart. And even if you don't speak Dutch and you speak German, there are still some similarities between the Afrikaans phrase and the German phrase. The German phrase reads, wie is dein Name? If we look at that second phrase, hy praat met my vriend, we see that there are similarities between Dutch and German as well. In Dutch, we have hy praat met mijn vriend, which is almost the exact same as the Afrikaans phrase. But we could also say hy spreek met mijn vriend. And that word spreek is very close to the German word spreekt. Spreekt met meinem Freund. But besides the similarities between these languages, there are things specific to Afrikaans that makes it easy for English speakers to learn. First of all, Afrikaans has no grammatical gender. If you've learned a language like French or even German, you know how much work sometimes it can take to learn grammatical gender. However, in Afrikaans, all nouns have the same gender. No gender. Furthermore, Afrikaans has very little complexity when it comes to verbs. If you've learned another language like French or Spanish, you know that conjugating verbs can be very complicated. Even if you count all the verb tenses in English, the complexity is immense. But Afrikaans does an amazing job of simplifying verbs. For example, the word slaap in Afrikaans means to sleep. When you want to put it with a subject, perhaps like a word I or we, you just put the word with the subject. You don't need to add any endings. In the chart, you'll see that the present tense form of the word slop is the same for all subjects. Now compare that with a language like Dutch, which takes a couple different endings, or even English, which takes the S in the third person singular form. And this simplification of verbs doesn't stop at the present tense. So what can I say? If you're looking for a foreign language to learn and you don't necessarily want to dedicate a lot of time to memorizing verb tables, or you just want a language that's close to English, Afrikaans is the language for you. Thanks for watching. Tot ziens!